Good evening, everyone. It's so exciting to welcome you tonight to the C.S. Lewis Foundation in joint partnership with the C.S. Lewis College in our fourth webinar series this evening. I'm Amber Saladin. I'm the artist coordinator for the C.S. Lewis Foundation. Tonight's guest is Dr. Elaine Howard Ecklund, speaking to us this evening on why a global pandemic makes scientists' views of religion matter even more. I'd like to take a moment to heartily thank all of our donors who have so generously given to make tonight's event possible. I'd like to also thank our volunteers, particularly Melanie Stiles and Jen Bonnert, who will be leading discussion groups later. And I'm delighted to see how many of you have signed up for the discussion groups. Let's open in a word of prayer. Our Father, we are so grateful that even over this technology, you connect us and you give us opportunities to continue to learn and to grow. We pray that tonight you would speak to our minds and our hearts by the power of your Holy Spirit. Use Elaine to stir in us that which you would have us know and those places that you want us to grow. In your name we pray. Amen. Our moderator this evening is Christopher Howell, a PhD candidate in American religion at Duke University. Hi, Chris. Nice
Hello.
to see you. So Chris is working on a dissertation on the history of religion and science. Chris has a master's degree in theological studies from Duke and a bachelor's in American history from the University of California in Riverside. He's currently teaching a course on C.S. Lewis at Duke University for the religion department. Chris is a funny guy who works odd jobs in video game development and in sports radio, and also teaches courses in, are you teaching English? You're teaching English in the Czech Republic.
I used to.
That's great. Sorry about
that was, in a bygone era.
In a bygone era. You grew up overseas, though, didn't you, Chris? You spent some time there.
I lived there for a while in the Czech Republic. That was where I learned to teach. It was an interesting experience because I had to teach students that didn't always speak English, and I didn't really speak Czech, so it was always sometimes a challenge.
A lot of hand signs. So Chris has been working for the C.S. Lewis Foundation since 2010, filling various roles as we all do, such as communications associate, conference staffer, registrar, event planner, and now is on our webinar development team. And the best thing about Chris Howell is that he has met his wife, Mary Carroll, at the C.S. Lewis Foundation in 2011. Was it really 2011? I kind of had you in 2008. I mean, I guess you know your dates.
That was when we met. I started working there in 2010.
Okay. I think that's a great use of your time, Chris. I'm so delighted that we were able to introduce you to Mary Carroll.
It's a little known side function of the C.S. Lewis Foundation that is not as well known.
Matchmaking, yeah. Welcome, Chris.
Well,
we're delighted to have you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm excited to be here and to be able to do this interview. I'm really looking forward to our talk tonight, and I'm excited to introduce to you all Professor Elaine Howard Ecklund, who is the Herbert S. Autry Chair in Social Sciences and the Professor of Sociology at Rice University, as well as founding director of the Religion and Public Life program. She's a sociologist who studies religion, immigration, and science, and examines how individuals bring changes to religious and scientific institutions. She is the author of 4 books with Oxford University Press and one with NYU Press, and a ton of articles and op-eds that you can find on her website. One of her most recent book is this one, Why Science and Faith Need Each Other, which just came out in 2020 and is going to be part of the what we're going to talk about today. In addition to writing all of these books, she has also given the prestigious Gifford Lectures in 2018, which in religion and science is a very, very honorable thing to do, a prestigious lecture. And in 2019, she was president for the Society of the Scientific Study of Religion. And so I'm very excited to welcome Professor Ecklund here to talk to us.
Hi, Chris. Thank you for having me. It's so great to be with you. And thanks for our guests that are joining us. It's a really special privilege to be part of a group that starts the evening with singing. So thank you for that. That was really neat. That was really neat.
Yeah, we've always had wanted to privilege arts and music, and in addition to the academic, uh, philosophical or historical or whatever component, that we feel it's important to have a holistic approach. So glad you appreciated it.
Yeah, I really did. I really did. I was singing my heart out. I kept looking down to make sure that I was actually on mute. I just wanted to say that, but I was indeed singing.
Well, so we're here on, in strange circumstances, due to COVID, and you had mentioned that you wanted to talk about that. But, I'm just interested in general, since I study religion and science too. Anytime I tell someone that I study this, they immediately have opinions, like right away. And they also usually have an assumption of conflict. That has almost always been my experience, regardless of whether I was like in a city like Los Angeles, if I was in rural Alabama. This even happened to me when I mentioned this to someone in a village in Greece, that was their first response. And so I was wondering if that's the same thing for you, if you have that same kind of reaction with people, and why, or if yours is different, why that might be as well.
Yeah, that's a great question that I'll just say what comes to mind. So I first started thinking about the connection between religion and science from the point of view of scientists themselves when I was a PhD student at Cornell University, where I did my PhD. And I remember being in a Bible study group. I was actually studying Bible studies. I'm a sociologist of religion. And so I was going to Bible studies for work. And studying some different things about changing family forms in the churches and synagogues and that I was studying. And I met this woman who asked me what I did. And I said, oh, I'm a PhD student at Cornell University. And she says, Cornell University, yuck. And I thought, oh my gosh, like, I'm sort of embarrassed. Like maybe she has some problem with Cornell. And then she went on and she said, like, I would never have my kids attend university at Cornell. I'm afraid the scientists there might take them away from their faith. And that was not my experience at all. Actually, when I was an undergraduate, I met scientists who were from different kinds of faiths and many faithful Christians. And I was really surprised that that was the perspective, but that there was that kind of fear. And I remember in that moment, I thought, I wonder what scientists actually think. Are they out to eat young Christian children for lunch? Or are there more nuanced views here? And so I kind of got that like bug, I should ask a wide variety of scientists what they think about the faith and science interface and about their own religious lives. And that's kind of how I got started. So definitely this kind of real animosity and conflict within churches to some extent. But then on the other side of thing, when I think about scientists, and I started to discover that there are many scientists who are people of faith and many scientists who are Christians in particular. I was doing an interview with a well-known science journalist at one point, and I remember, he asked me the proportion of scientists who are people of faith. And then he says, like, that's just not true. It's absolutely impossible for a person to be a scientist and also be a practicing Christian, because we were talking about Christianity in this particular case. I said, well, that's what I'm finding. That's what my science shows. That's what my social science shows. And he just wouldn't believe me. The idea that these two things could be together in the same person was just not possible with his particular way of viewing the world.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more, because much of your research has been about what religious people in churches think about scientists, and then also what scientists in the academy think about religion. And then I was wondering if you could talk about maybe some of the big picture stuff that you've discovered that's maybe surprising to people, and then maybe talk a little about your personal experience, because you've talked to us before about how your husband is a particle physicist. So this is something that you live with, not just as an academic, but in a personal way too.
Yeah, I like to tell people I got so into studying scientists that I decided to go the whole way and marry one. But yeah, my husband is a particle physicist. We're both professors at Rice University. And Carl, my husband, works in the CERN experiment. And it's really I would say lots of things surprise me. I'll just pick the ones that I'm thinking of right now. I think there are a lot more religious scientists than people think, and they're religiously different sometimes than the general public. Scientists often are tough on their pastors. They're people who are naturally questioning and want to talk about really significant things, want to talk about the scientific work and the impact that it has on their understandings of faith. So they ask hard questions of the faith. And I think that's great. I think it's great to have them in churches, to have them doing that. So there are more religious scientists, I think, than people think. Depending on how one counts these things, about 50% of scientists in the U.S. consider themselves part of a religious tradition. And about 30% are practicing in terms of, going to a church or a synagogue regularly and being part of an actual faith community in that way. Those scientists who are not religious, who aren't part of a faith community, often are very spiritual. So there are a lot of scientists who consider themselves spiritual but not religious, and see spirituality as giving them special kinds of insights alongside or integrated with scientific work. And then a third kind of insight, so there are more religious scientists, there are spiritual scientists, and then there are certainly atheist scientists, but I think atheist scientists have gotten kind of a bad rap, Chris. They're a lot more diverse. I actually have felt compelled, in part, I think, because of my own Christian understandings, to write a book about atheist scientists. And so with a colleague, David Johnson at University of Nevada, Reno, we have a book that's coming out next year called Varieties of Atheism in Science. And so happy to talk more about that if folks are interested or you're interested.
I'm wondering then, like, who's responsible then for the perception? Is it just someone like Richard Dawkins? Is it his fault that people kind of think this way about how scientists view religion?
Yeah, I feel kind of compelled not to always throw Richard Dawkins under the bus. He has done a lot of, I think, really wonderful work, kind of enlivening people's interest in science and showing people all the wonders of science. And I think that's really cool. And I think, as Christians, we can honor that appreciation for science and agree with him, because we believe that science itself originates with God and is very much a natural outworking of our Christian faith. But the kind of very active stereotyping of religious people, the sort of propelling of the conflict. If I were giving you a formal slideshow kind of presentation, I would put up colorful quotes about Richard Dawkins, because he has many of them. But others who write actively, Sam Harris, the well-known neuroscientist. There are other folks, the late Christopher Hitchens. There are folks who've written really actively, kind of pushing this conflict idea. And it's just not representative of the broad set of scientists. And of most surprise to me, not even of atheist scientists. So I would have expected that atheist scientists would be the most like someone like Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris. And they're really discouraged by those kinds of views often, and think that being so angry and so negative about religion and religious people actually turns religious people away from science. And so if you think about, you're a historian, so perhaps you can fill in as well, but if you think about the history of ideas, sometimes when people write a lot and books really sell well, it then gives the impression that a larger group of people have the ideas than really do. So the new atheism, as those folks like to call themselves, is not really a social movement as much as it is a collection of writers who've been incredibly successful. They're very effective communicators. And so I think we need other kinds of models that are perhaps more representative of who scientists, even who atheist scientists really are.
Yeah, since you mentioned history, and that is my field, that in general, the historical consensus is the conflict thesis about how religion and science are necessarily at odds with each other has been pretty universally rejected by historians of science.
Very much so. Very much so.
And so I think it's significant then, at least in the new atheist movement, that they don't actually have any historians. I feel maybe explains a little bit, but I appreciate that you wanted to mention the positive things about Dawkins's work too. I mean, and I've always noticed this in him, that he has this very real sense of wonder and like gratitude towards nature, even though, he's not religious, but he shares that feeling that many of us do too. And so that leads me then to the question I wanted to ask about the harmony from your book. Because you argue not only should there not be conflict, but that they need each other. That there are eight shared values.
That's right.
That connect religion and science. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about those, especially I think for me, when I read the book, which I really enjoyed, is humility. I thought was a very significant and important one. And so I was hoping maybe you could talk a little bit about that in your research.
Yeah, this is a book that I'm really hoping folks in churches will pick up and read and talk to me about. I have done about 15 years of research for academic audiences on what scientists think about faith and people of faith think about science. And Christian communities are often quite unique in their sense of there being somewhat of a conflict, especially particular kinds of Christian communities. Evangelical Christians, theologically conservative Christians tend to be more likely to think that there is a conflict. And in particular, to be very, and this was ironic to me, Chris, to be extremely affirming of science. I actually think that Christians, particularly evangelical Christians, have been stereotyped a lot by some in the science community and by the media as being anti-science. And actually, they're very affirming of science, have about the same level of science knowledge as the rest of the general population, are as likely to send their kids into science majors, some types of science majors. But they think that scientists as a people group are really against them. And so when I found that, I got thinking, is there anything that could hold these communities together? I remember talking to this, just through my work, to this scientist who's a Christian, and him saying, at the end of the day, I think of my community in my church and my community of scientists as both being groups of people that God loves. And I got thinking, wow, somehow the way that he said that to me really struck me and was stated in a much more profound way than I had heard before. I really heard what he said, like somehow you have a kind of moment of insight. And I thought, I've been looking for ways to dispel conflict between these two communities, but I haven't really intentionally started looking for common ground between the communities. I haven't looked for any common ground. And when I did, I started thinking about virtues and values that these two communities hold in common, and actually went back through all my data that I have collected over the past 15 years and started looking for common ways of talking about things in the science and faith arena that might bring these communities together. And that was a really profound experience for me. And the values that I discuss in the book are not exhaustive. There would be other things that one could have discussed, but the things that I noticed most often in my data and the things that also spoke to me personally through my own science and faith journey.
I mean, it's striking to me, and I think significant, that in finding out all these maybe sort of unexpected things, that you did it in focusing on scientists as people and not maybe science as an abstract concept.
Very much so.
Yeah, and that humanizes everyone in a different way, of evangelical Christians as people, Catholics as people, scientists as people, and often they're in the same communities and they don't know it. That was what could take away for me from your book, was how a lot of scientists are in congregations and they don't always let everyone know because they're a little bit worried sometimes about how even people in their community might react. And And so one of the main questions then that you wanted to talk about when we talked to you beforehand was not only about why do scientists' views of religion matter, because they do, but also why they matter even more now when we're in the midst of this pandemic.
Yeah, we're in the midst of a lot, as a nation, in the US at least, and in the globe, of course, we're in a global pandemic. Um, in the US, we're in a time of great political polarization. And it seems like now is a time above any other to think about reflecting any area where there is common ground. And so um, I've thought about this a lot. I'm actually teaching a class at my church on the book. I'm so honored that the church is allowing me to do this. I can't believe that I have this opportunity, actually. And I'm just trying to learn from those in the congregation, some of whom are scientists, and share together the kinds of things that are really bringing us together rather than the things that are tearing us apart. And I think that maybe is a particular responsibility of the Christian church in the US right now, is to be a people who are bridge builders among disparate groups.
Yeah, what are some ways that we can do that as a practical way of thinking? I mean, we can cultivate these virtues, I feel like is an important takeaway from the book. Um, what do you suggest to those of us who maybe haven't read it or are listening in and want to read it? What do you recommend?
Yeah, I am incredibly thankful for science and medicine. I mean, I have one of the virtues and values I talk about that really brings together both church communities and the scientific community is a sense of shared gratitude. And I think it's very hard to wake up in these times and think of things that we're thankful for. But I do think it's more important than ever to do so. I write about this in the book, but I have a chronic illness. I've had rheumatoid arthritis since I was about 11. And the kind of medical advances that I've experienced during my lifetime to address my disease are absolutely incredible and would not be possible without certain groups of people just completely flat out devoting their lives to the calling of scientific research. And so I think being incredibly grateful for medical advances, for the scientists who are working day and night right now to try to discover a vaccine for COVID. So to just really lean into that sense of gratitude, I think is incredibly important right now. In practical ways, if there are scientists in your church community, could you thank them right now for the work that they're doing? If there are medical scientists, if there are doctors and nurses and other caregivers in the medical world, I think it's incredibly important to be grateful. There is also, you mentioned at the beginning, Chris, but this idea of humility. Humility is absolutely key in scientific work. The scientists I've interviewed said it over and over again that the very best scientists have a deep sense of humility. I was actually just thinking about this today because I'm going to teach on this in the Sunday school class, but I came across this quote from Albert Einstein, who said this: "It gave me great pleasure to tell you about the mysteries with which physics confronts us." Albert Einstein once wrote in a letter to the Queen of Belgium. "As a human being, one has been endowed with just enough intelligence to be able to see clearly how utterly inadequate that intelligence is when confronted with what exists. If such humility could be conveyed to everybody, the world of human activities would be more appealing." We have right now, among some groups, a sense of assuredness that we know the whole truth. And I think what we have, and I think C.S. Lewis had this so beautifully, is a deep sense of intellectual humility, a deep sense that God is God and we are not, and that we'll never know the whole truth. And science, the best science, really cultivates that sense of humility. And I think as Christians, we have a particular responsibility to cultivate that sense of deep intellectual and relational and other kinds of humility.
I think you can even see the explicitly like Christian connection there, in the sense that humility, at least I'm not a classicist, but as far as I understand, humility was not thought of as a virtue in the Greco-Roman world before Christianity. There were a lot of shared virtues with Christianity later, but humility was not one, and it became a virtue after the Christian Revolution, essentially, in the ancient world. And so to have it be a fundamental part of science too, I think shows some critical common ground at the bottom. I did want to point out, so some people have had some issues with submitting questions. So if the question and answer function works for you, then go ahead and use that. If you are having difficulties, maybe use the chat function to send to everybody. And so right now, actually, we just got one that I would like to ask from Jonathan Mayer. This is a good question about how, so he says he attended an evangelical church for years, and that many of the parishioners were professors in the hard sciences, so say physics or chemistry or biology. Almost none taught in the human or social sciences. And so he's wondering about like this sort of reputation about the social sciences and soft sciences maybe being different in their reaction to religion, sometimes even maybe less open to it than say physics, which at least in my experience seems to have more religious people in it.
Yeah, so I did, Jonathan, I did a study in 2010. I have a book called Science versus Religion, What Scientists Really Think, and actually studied both the natural and social sciences, and did not find there to be much religious difference between the natural and social sciences. I know what you're referring to, though. There actually have been a couple of well-known papers published that argued the social sciences are a good deal less religious than the natural sciences. And when you go outside of the major elite research universities, that does seem to be the case, that there is a difference between the natural and the social sciences and levels of religiosity, with the social sciences being a bit less religious than the natural sciences. There have been lots of theories for why that's potentially the case. Some have argued that there is a stronger culture in the social sciences of being irreligious. There's some interesting intellectual history written about this, that some of the social sciences were set up as an antidote to religion-based social work. And so there's a kind of secularity to the social sciences. In my own field of sociology, there's quite a robust sociology of religion right now. And I think some of that kind of thing is an antidote to that sort of history, if it was there in the first place. That's a great question.
Yeah, I think that you even see this perception of it in Lewis himself in the screw tape letters. I think in like the first or second letter, he mentions how like the nephew Wormwood should keep the patient distracted from like existence and the cosmos and big metaphysical questions by steering him away from physics and having him study economics or something instead. That's something that would keep his mind off of it. But it seems like from your research, maybe that's not necessarily an accurate take.
Yeah, that's a big question. Yeah, no, I think that's not as significant now among modern day science and social sciences as it was.
Yeah, I guess when he wrote that, it was in the 40s. So, there were these famous cases of these religious physicists like, Werner Heisenberg or
Faraday. Yeah, that's right.
And so, Lemaitre and so on. So maybe I think that probably was what he was referring to. Well, one thing I wanted to ask then, related to the big question, perception of science, living in this pandemic, we in general are having kind of a moment where it's difficult to know who to trust about scientific information, about scientists themselves, elites. And I'm wondering what you think about how we address that as the communities that we live in. How do we navigate when it seems confusing about, who's an authority on these kinds of things?
Yeah, there's always trust involved, isn't there? And I do think that the best science it's not, it's never completely certain, right? There's never complete certainty. And I think we can say that in faith too, there's never complete certainty. But the best science has a preponderance of evidence. So we know that we don't have smallpox really in much of the world because of the kind of scientific effort that was made, or polio, to eradicate those diseases. And so I think as Christians, we need to be real leaders in affirming good science. And that's one reason why there need to be excellent Christian scientists who can be bridge builders between the science community and non-scientists within churches. Sadly, when scientists are in congregations, often I find that they're not, you alluded to this, Chris, they're not talking very much about their scientific work. I think they fear that those in their congregations will maybe be suspicious of their faith or something. And I think it's incredibly important that their spiritual leaders really encourage them to see discussion of their scientific work within the congregation as a piece of their spiritual calling as well, and really welcome that kind of modeling.
So we have a couple comments from Lena Corinth here, and one of them is related to what you just said. She brought up about Francis Collins as an example of somebody as like a positive exemplar. And he's significant to us at the C.S. Lewis Foundation, one, because he spoke for us in the past, but also because he very prominently attributed a lot of his religious experience to reading C.S. Lewis when he was in college. And so I feel like maybe, he's probably someone you're referring to as maybe a figurehead of how we should look, what the kind of person we should look for to trust about science. And so I'm wondering also, so her other question is, what is your opinion of the majority of scientists that do not believe, related especially to COVID and suffering and death? So like when you see what's going on right now with something like COVID, which seems like a natural catastrophe, and we think about science, how do we think about religion and science in that light when there's something so terrible like this going on?
Yeah, I think the scientific community and faith communities do have in common a deep desire to address and alleviate suffering. And at the same time, I want to be careful how I talk here, because we want to acknowledge the horrific suffering that COVID has brought, and the incredible pain that many are witnessing. And at the same time, suffering has the possibility, there is such a thing as the redemption of suffering. And I do think Christians can provide, the Christian tradition has a deep well of redemption within the context of suffering, which can be communicated thoughtfully in these times. And I think the scientific community and the medical community is really looking for that. We are doing at Rice University a small study right now where we're tracking religious communities in Houston, how they're responding to COVID, just to kind of see how a variety of them are responding. And we're finding that in general, faith communities are responding really well, that they're closing when it seems right in terms of health practice to do so, that they're following social distancing guidelines and mask guidelines, and they're really following medical advice. But I'm so hopeful that those in the medical sciences and science more broadly will do more that the Christians in those communities will do more to speak out within their churches and to help folks really understand what's going on. At my own church in Houston, we've led a couple of seminars with epidemiologists and scientists and physicians in our congregation, just talking to the rest of the congregation over Zoom about what's going on and me interviewing them. And I think that kind of model could be incredibly helpful during these times.
Yeah, so that perfectly leads into the question that Linda Kern just put, where she wanted to know, how do Christians encourage acceptance in congregations in a practical way, and maybe how best to avoid that getting maybe confrontational or difficult, especially when people have strong beliefs about science when it comes to a lot of different issues. I mean, for me in particular, I study evolution and religion, so that's one that comes up in my mind a lot. But the question about like how to encourage acceptance, like what we can do as individuals in our congregations, I think is an important one.
We tend to think of science as this incredibly abstract thing, an abstract body of knowledge. And I think sometimes we think of our faith that way too, that we think like theology is a set of propositions. And I think it's really important to remember that we serve a very embodied God, that Jesus walked among us. So the Christian faith is an embodied one. And so sometimes the best way to address the most difficult kind of contentious issues is through embodied experience. So by that, I mean, let's have scientists who tell their story of how they understand the wonder of the scientific world, how they're dealing with suffering during these times. Let's hear from the nurses, let's hear from the doctors and walk with them rather than talk about these things only in the realm of abstract ideas. I'm all for the intellect. I mean, I'm a university professor. I am pro-intellect. But I think when it comes to, I've over the years, I've kind of changed my view about how to address controversial issues. And now I think, and research shows this, that you listen best and change your mind when someone you know and trust conveys the information to you. So first, the bridges, I think, have to be built through relationship, and then we can walk ideas over those bridges. And that's very different than how I used to think about things as an academic when I first started out. I'm still learning how to do this best, but I think that kind of deep relationship building is incredibly important and strategic, and ought to be leveraged well, during these times.
Yeah, that's affecting for all of us because we are all in a position where we could do that, and maybe even in a small scale. And so that I appreciate that push from you about that. I think it's important for us to take away. What I want to do real quick is take just a short break to throw it over to Stephen Elmore, our Executive Vice President of the C.S. Lewis Foundation, just to give a brief description of our upcoming virtual summit. So Steve, if you would pop on screen.
Hi, Chris. Hi, Elaine. How are you both?
Good.
Doing well.
Good to see you. So I'm excited to announce our first ever C.S. Lewis Virtual Summit that we're having next month on November 12th, 13th, and 14th. It's a kind of our version of our C.S. Lewis retreat that we have in the fall. But of course, we can't all meet in person, so we're doing this online. The way it's going to work, though, is we know you're at home. We know you can't spend your entire day with us. So what we're doing is we're meeting on Thursday night, the 12th, Friday night, the 13th, and Saturday morning and afternoon, depending on your time zone, on the 14th. And we're having a kind of a miniature virtual conference. The theme is Deeper Magic, C.S. Lewis and the Serious Business of Heaven. And for those of you that have read enough Lewis, The Serious Business of Heaven is from Letters to Malcolm. And it is from Lewis's line, the serious business of heaven is joy. So the conference will be about hope and joy, and since it'll be after the election, that's probably a good thing to focus on, the deeper things of our faith. And we're pleased to have a great lineup of speakers: Karen Swallow Pryor, Andrew Peterson, Malcolm Geit, and also Terry Glaspie. Some of those you've met before through Foundation events. A couple might be new to you. But we'll have, it'll be a mix of lectures, Q&A sessions, interviews like this, and also discussion groups after each. So we hope that you'll be able to join us. Again, that's November 12th, 13th, and 14th. If you'd like more information, go to cslewis.org/webinar. Or if you just go to cslewis.org on our website, point up to events, and the virtual summit will pop up to you. And actually, it's cslewis.org/summit, not webinar. My bad. So back to you guys. Thank you so much, Elaine and Chris, and look forward to a little bit more.
One thing I wanted to go back to is, you mentioned about the way that people view science maybe a little bit differently based on their church tradition, in especially in the United States. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what those differences might be.
Yeah. In one study that we did, we spent a lot of time with Christians in different racial groups. So looking at churches, largely Black churches in different cities around the country, largely Hispanic churches, and largely white churches, as well as multi-ethnic congregations, all within the Christian tradition. And largely white evangelical congregations do sometimes have mistrust of scientists and of particular kinds of scientific knowledge, have concerns about evolution in particular, human reproductive genetic technologies, gene editing kinds of things. And we found that especially in largely Black congregations, there is a different kind of mistrust based on concerns that science may not be safe. Folks remember the Tuskegee syphilis trials, for example, and there's a sense of what we call in sociological language of a community of memory. Even if you didn't experience that kind of difficulty and that kind of racist use of science, maybe this mistrust is passed through your community. And so there's something different going on there. And folks in largely Black churches told our research team that it's especially important, as one pastor put it, to see a scientist to hear a scientist who believes like me and see a scientist who looks like me. So it's incredibly, I think there's a real openness to getting Hispanic scientists and Black scientists in particular, who are persons of faith, into church communities to talk and to encourage kids to go into science. And so one of the initiatives that we've been working on is trying to work with the science community to see churches, and especially in certain kinds of communities, churches are extremely pro-education, to work with the science community to see churches as a kind of site of outreach, which would be unusual, which we don't usually see it that way, but I think could have a really profound impact.
Yeah, Lori Tischler asked a similar question about maybe the influence, what we can do in our church communities with people that we know and trust and care for, and what to do when something like this arises, maybe, and how to deal with maybe the influence of social media that it has on attitudes of science towards science. And I'm wondering, because this is something I wonder about in my own community too. I feel like I experienced this, at least, maybe now not as much since we can't go as often because of COVID, but before that, I'm wondering what you think about that. I mean, is social media a big influence on this in your experience? And if so, what do we do to deal with that?
Yeah. I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. What a horrible phrase. So that's what you get from me late at night. But there is a sense where, social media can be used to many good aims, is what I mean by that. Mm-hmm. But I do not think social media is the best place to discuss controversial issues or issues that people are insecure about. The conversations about faith and science are not one and done kinds of conversations, that they tend to be long haul kinds of things that people need to keep coming back to until they understand at a deeper level, until they feel comfortable. And I think, we need to have a sense of humility and to not take ourselves so seriously in these kinds of conversations. I think that's really important in the science community as well, that scientists need to, I'm not saying I need to be careful for the scientists around the call. I'm not saying they need to lay down scientific findings that there's a ton of evidence, but that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm talking about having a sense of humility about how you present yourself. You don't win any friends by, beating people over the head with ideas, even if they are the correct ideas. And so we need to enter into more civil conversation with one another. And that's really, really hard to do. And I'm hoping my friends on the call who are part of church communities will see this as a really important mission to model what it means to have civil conversation in these times.
We just got another really interesting question from Jonathan Mayer about, he wants to know how you as a Christian sociologist would address a very different kind of scientific things. This is maybe a little bit more related to technology, but the grandiose claims of maybe artificial intelligence advocates, which seem to me, in likening mind and machine, maybe dangerous and reductive to Christian perspectives. And that makes me think of someone like Ray Kurzweil or something, with the technological singularity. What do you think about that?
AI is hard because there are, we go quickly to the uploading one's brain to the web, right? And as a way of having eternal life kind of thing. Oh, my dog just entered the background. But we don't want to, there are lots of different kinds of artificial intelligence kinds of technologies. There are technologies which, we need to think as Christians about issues of inequality. There are artificial intelligence technologies that take away jobs that are filled by generally working class people. So there is that dimension of the ethics of AI. There is amazing AI that can be used in medical contexts to do things that we wouldn't be able to do necessarily. And then there are forms of AI that are being used in ways that violate our humanness, which we as Christians affirm that we are all made in the image of God. And so I think I'm not trying to get away from the question. It's an excellent question. But I think thinking about AI as being at different levels and different types and addressing the ethics of each of those types individually, I think is extremely important in terms of developing a thoughtful approach. The last thing I'll say about AI is that this is alongside a whole set of things in terms of scientific technology where theological and ethical reflection necessarily proceeds slowly. And often scientific technology more rapidly develops at a pace that our ethical and theological reflection cannot keep up with. And I think it behooves us under those certain circumstances not to fall prey to making snap judgments and trying to have the kind of pace that the scientific technology has. But we are protectors, especially organizations like the C.S. Lewis Foundation. We're really protectors of this long haul kind of reflection, which is there aren't very many places in society anymore where you get that. And so I think it's really important to cultivate that well.
I think the wisest statement from the Lord of the Rings to me is when Treebeard says, "Let's not be hasty." I feel like that maybe that is a good summary of what you were just talking about. We've talked a lot about religion and science in the United States. And one thing that's interesting about some of your research is that you point out that a lot of what holds here in the relationship is very different in other countries. In particular, in one of your books, you mentioned about Taiwan and Hong Kong, which I thought was really interesting, about that the relationship between religion and science and the perception of it is almost flipped. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk about why that is and why it's different here and what that means.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, for that question. So a book that our team wrote last year is called Secularity in Science, What Scientists Around the World Really Think About Religion. And we studied 8 different national contexts. So let's see if I can remember them. It took us 5 years to do the study. So we looked at the US and UK, but also in Europe at France and Italy and Turkey. And so which has a kind of Eurasian sensibility. We looked at Hong Kong and Taiwan and India. And we found that in Taiwan and Hong Kong, the proportion of scientists who are religious people is actually greater than the proportion of those in the general population who are religious. And our scientists were kind of our greatest teachers. So we did the survey and then we did follow-up interviews with scientists who participated in the survey. And it was really, really fun because we just asked them, like, we got these kind of intriguing survey responses, and what do you think of that? And so scientists had all these kinds of theories, and we tested some of them out. And it seems like in Hong Kong in particular, because of the historic influence of Catholic missionaries, that there is a sense where some of the best education systems are Catholic or Christian more broadly. And so it's, one Hong Kongese scientist said, it's kind of like we have a Christian mafia here. Like it's almost like the Christians get the best grants and the best stuff. He didn't necessarily say that positively. He felt like Christians were gatekeepers in a way that they shouldn't always be, because they knew each other from these educational institutions. Taiwan is a really interesting place. There's more religious plurality than there is in Hong Kong. And in Taiwan, there's this sense where, you know, there's a lot of openness to discussing religion. It wasn't uncommon for Taiwan scientists to say to us that, you know, their scientific work was really guided by their faith in very particular ways. And that was kind of unusual among the nations that we studied.
Yeah, and so that makes me wonder about the social causes behind something like this. You know, my experience with a lot of scientists is there's a little bit of a kind of some pride about being maybe countercultural, being a little bit standing abroad the culture of maybe the country that they're in. And so we have maybe the perception in the United States of scientists not being so religious in a country that is religious, but then in China, a country that is officially not religious, and Hong Kong and Taiwan with their troubled relationship with the mainland. Is there any connection between those two things?
Yeah, that's a really interesting theory. I love that. So this idea that maybe scientists see themselves as kind of outsiders or something, or intellectual renegades. I do think there's something to be said for that. Scientists like to think of themselves as culturally distinctive. That actually came up in several different ways in our studies. And I think that's kind of cool. There are people who think outside the box, who often as children were, you know, very creative and inquisitive children. I think about the kind of implications this work for people who do youth ministry. Often the scientists who decided that, you know, who were, say, raised in Christian homes and decided that Christianity was not for them, didn't walk away from Christianity in graduate school. They did, you know, as young kids. And so what would it mean to kind of cultivate that sense of inquisitiveness and creativity about the faith in church communities? I kind of think about that end of it too sometimes.
So I think we have time for one last question before maybe we'll get your final statement and we'll conclude. Linda Naunapur asked that, so she's worked as an anthropologist with American Indian communities and says that she's experienced a lot of what you're talking about. And part of her career success has come from using Christian perspective to be a bridge for change of understanding about science. But it wasn't as well received within her academic community. So any thoughts about how academia as a whole maybe might accept religious perspectives in teaching science, especially to underrepresented groups, or to even groups in our own churches?
That's a great question. I just gave a talk to the American Association for the Advancement of Science last week, a webinar, and we talked about the ways in which religion could be used to increase racial and gender diversity in science, because racial and ethnic minorities and women of all racial groups tend to be much more religious than white men are. And I think that's something the science community needs to think about. I really tried to give good data showing that that could be a really important intersection. But I think the questioner is right on the money there, that we need to have more openness both in the academic community and in church communities. There's lots I could say about that. If you want to reach out to me, maybe someone could put my email address in the chat window. It's ehe@rice.edu. I'm happy to have further email conversation about that. I do find sometimes that academic communities are, how shall I say, de facto secular. It's not necessarily in my experience that people are necessarily hostile to what I do. I mean, I try to publish well and publish in good journals, and I think my colleagues certainly respect me fine. It's more that they don't think of religious organizations as being important to other kinds of social phenomenon. You know, about 85% of the world's population is religious. Religion affects almost every aspect of social life. But because of the kind of de facto secularity of some academic communities, it's just not a go-to. And I think that's important. And then it's, then the onus is on me to some extent to bring it up in thoughtful ways.
All right. Well, thank you very much. That takes us to about the end of time. We did put Dr. Ecklund's email in the chat for those of you who would like to reach out to her and talk about any of this more. I will give you maybe the final word here before we close.
Yeah, I think those of us on this call share a common faith. And I think especially right now in relationship to faith and science, but in relationship to a whole host of issues that we're facing in our society, it's important to remember that the Christian faith is not a fragile faith. C.S. Lewis and other thinkers are great resources, as well as our own scriptures and broader theological understanding that this is a time when we have an opportunity, given what we're experiencing, to go more deeply into the faith. And I think that's extremely important to remember right now. It's been such a pleasure to be with you tonight. Really appreciate those who've been listening during this time.
Well, we can't thank you enough for joining us. And this is always something really interesting to me. I could talk about this for 24 straight hours, probably without stopping. But I think at the risk of tiring everybody else out, this is a good point to end. So we thank you so much, Professor Ecklund, for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you at future events. For those of you, we will now be able to go to the discussion groups. And so for those of you that signed up beforehand during registration to do so, you will need to access the separate email that has a different link to do that. And so we look forward to talking with you more in the discussion groups. And we thank you for joining us and for your support. We couldn't do any of this without you. And we thank once again Professor Ecklund for coming and teaching us and talking to us tonight.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure to be with you all.